let Trump get reelected? What?
Cities burned.
Times to be organized and orchestrated chaos.
They call everybody they disagree with Nazis.
I felt like I had no choice but to do what I did.
So yeah, kill them. Kill the Nazis.
Long live the socialist revolution.
And when conditions become right, people do get the opportunity to change the whole system through a revolutionary struggle.
Die Brüderlichen und die revolutionären Grüße.
The International Revolutionary People's Guerrilla Forces work to defend social revolutions around the world.
We gotta fight it out. We're gonna remake this country in the street.
Liberals get the f***ing wall first.
Someday, we gotta knock those motherfuckers who control this thing right on their ass.
George Floyd's life is going to matter, and his death is going to count for something. It has to lead to the death of
America. Organization Refuse Fascism, refusefascism.org, has put forward a call and a plan and is actively building for that mass mobilization.
Police killed a man allegedly trying to burn down a detention center. Seattle Anti-Fascist Action is hailing that Antifa disciple as a martyr.
Body cam video released by Seattle police show the violent confrontation between officers and protesters.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly.
And when conditions become right, people do get the opportunity to choose a different system. That is to change the whole system through a revolutionary struggle and a revolutionary transformation.
While they do this under the cover of anti-fascism, the reality is that Antifa defines the entire American political system, regardless of party affiliation, as fascism.
Some protesters at some building in Portland, Oregon.
You disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now?
That's a myth. This division, this insurrectionist revolutionary arm of American politics, that Antifa represents, it serves the interests of Russia and China, because as they seek to weaken America on the world stage, Antifa seeks to usurp and revolt against America here in our own domestic backyard. That is the threat that they pose. That is their goal. They don't support Republicans. They don't support Democrats. They support anarchy and violent revolution. That is who they are. And so those that would benefit from that do include America's foreign adversaries.
Hey, sounds good.
We all go through our everyday lives through a set of routines. We wake up, get dressed, make coffee, have food, get the kids ready, drop them off, go to work, do your job, come home, repeat. And throughout the course of our days, we're faced with a series of day-to-day problems. Common stuff that we know how to deal with. Get a flat tire, you have traffic on your way to work. You have to charge your phone. This is common stuff. These are common problems. But then there's also social problems. And we learn about social problems through the media, through local news, through newspapers, local TV. And every once in a while, local problems, social problems, become national problems. And that's why we have the role of the national media. And that's what the national media is for. To help us be informed about those problems, and then also teach us about potential options and solutions to deal with them. But what if there were a problem that the media wasn't telling us about at any level? And what if that problem became a day-to-day problem? And for some reason, those trusted outlets, or when you go to Twitter Trends or Google News, it's not there and it's not found. And what happens when that problem becomes a threat? Not only a threat in one place or one location, but in city after city after city, night after night after night. And you can see the videos and you can find out what's happening. But when you go to those trusted sources and you go to those leaders, they try to downplay it. They say it's just an idea. They say it's nothing to be worried about. Tell you to look over here. When something like that does happen, it's time to sit down and have a serious conversation about what is going on. So one of the reasons I wanted to do a project like this was because there's so many people out there who have an idea of an Antifa, right? They've seen the people dressed in black. They might know what a black bloc is. They watch the videos on social media. They wake up every morning. They see the videos out there. They say, oh, this is Antifa. Look, there they are again. Look, this is the Antifa. See the guys, they've got the A and the shields, you know, the riot shields and everything. There they are. But I wanted to do a project that actually talks about the Antifa, to give people an understanding of what this movement actually is, the types of people in it, and the history of this movement and these people. The fact that there are so many various traditions that they are drawing upon that have sort of melded together and blended into what we see today as this iteration of Antifa in the world, Antifa in North America and Western Europe. And I guess if you're looking for a textbook definition of what Antifa is, they are an anti-government extremist organization that seeks the overthrow of the US government through violent insurrection. But not just the government, every institution in Western society, because they view Western society as fascist. And so institutions like religions, commerce, banking and finance, social media companies, right? Everything that is currently holding up our society, to them, is their enemy. And to tell that story, we've got to start at the beginning. This group, this movement that's out there, the various different cells that are organized in different locations around the country, that it actually is part of a much longer history that's drawing from various different traditions around the world, because you've got stuff that ties into the anarchist movement of the late 1800s, Chicago, Buffalo, right? William McKinley, everything that was going on in Europe prior to World War I. You've also got the communist movements of Asia, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the killing fields of Cambodia. All of these things have been melding together for a long time. Spanish Civil War, right? That go into what has become this fused group. And it's very hard to pin down any one specific ideology. or one specific end state to this group, to this movement. But what they do want is clear. They want an end to society as it currently stands. Their enemy is the status quo. And to use their own words, they will achieve their goals by any means necessary.
Antifa is an idea, but it's also a violent terror group that is the tip of the spear of leftist direct action in the United States and throughout the world. Antifa gets a pass from so many institutions because a lot of the mainstream have, in the last 10 years especially, thanks to social media, have really shifted far left. Institutions that used to be known as moderate or mainstream or commentators or people have gone completely, have moved very far left. And I think a lot of this has to do with the reinforcement that we see on social media, the constant barrage of hot takes and one-upsmanship when it comes to politics and partisanship and ideology. It used to be that Salon was known as a punchline. The Salon hot take was, completely crazy and left-wing. And now Salon is firmly in the mainstream. The New York Times sounds like Salon. And Democratic candidates for president sound like Salon. So, of course, the media and politicians are giving Antifa a pass because they don't really see the radicalism, or they don't want to see it.
There's been a lot of talk about Antifa being just an idea, and I don't think that there's any reason to believe it's just an idea. We've seen countless Facebook groups and social media personas coming out and saying that they identify as Antifa. I think what makes people think it's an idea is this idea of self-identifying as Antifa. The way that movements work now is not that you need to attend meetings, you don't need to get a card, you don't need to go to a secret church basement and have a passcode. You just need to say that you're part of it and track it yourself. And that's enough to be involved. You wear the costume, you spout the ideology, you do the things that other people who identify that way do, and then you're part of it. It's very much like the Arab Spring situation where people were doing the thing. You don't have to join up. Just saying that you're joined up is part of it. So I think that our elected leaders misunderstand it because they don't understand how social media movements work.
Their role, honestly, is kind of confusing, I guess. That's something that I feel most people feel, but no one has really been able to explain why it's confusing for the left. They don't know whether to conflate Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and then of course the Black Lives Matter movement. We're told constantly that Antifa is merely an idea of anti-fascism and not an organization. However, that's antithetical to what the original Antifa actually was. The original Antifa was an organization that sparked from an idea. And so I feel like when they say that it's not an organization, as if that's something to just celebrate, I feel like that's disingenuous, and it also just makes me question the motives of those who do uplift Antifa. Because as a historian of leftist activism movements from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, one thing that I do know is that if they were genuinely on the side of the BLM activists that they sometimes protest beside, in other leftists, then they would be being vehemently attacked by all sides of the mainstream media. They would not necessarily have allies in what I like to refer to as the neoliberal media.
My name is Gabriel Nadales. I'm a former Antifa activist. And the first time I put on the black mask and I really became part of the anti-fascist movement was in 2011. And I remember wanting to do this because I saw that a bunch of neo-Nazis were going to organize really close to my city, about 10, 15 minutes away. And at that point, I had already been a left-wing activist. I attended different pro-union marches as well as pro-immigration rallies. But that was the very first time that I did something radical, if you will. At that point, I remember meeting a lot of different activists who were also wearing the black mask, being part of the Black Bloc. And that's kind of how I got introduced to the anti-fascist movement. They invited me to other events all throughout Southern California, including the anarchist book fairs in Los Angeles and Orange County. And at some point, I have no idea how I started doing this, but I was breaking windows like I did once for, I broke a McDonald's windows. Another thing that I did, I went to the home of a CEO and we were shouting threats outside his house simply because we wanted to, quote unquote, hold him accountable for his crimes against nature. And to be honest, I don't even know exactly what he did. I just know that somehow he was culpable.
When you look back at the history of Antifa, where it comes from, which countries have had Antifa there, it's very clear that it always started in the way it seems to be starting here in the United States. They start with some vandalism, common vandalism. Then they move on to bigger targets, things like local government buildings. Then, you get the federal courthouses. Maybe they're looting at first, smashing some private businesses up, a few punch-ups on the street with opposing groups. But when Antifa really gets going, you look at the Red Army brigades in Italy as an example, you look at the Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, and they get very brazen very quickly, especially if it's not addressed. You've seen the kidnapping and murder of politicians that oppose Antifa. You've seen them bombing the US Army base in Frankfurt. The Red Army brigades in Italy went very quickly from being just a kind of low-level gang to being a domestic terror organization that wreaked havoc, not just upon the lives of ordinary people, the lives of police officers. Think about where we've seen that before. But also on the lives of ordinary people. You're starting to see it here in the United States as well, with Antifa and their brigades targeting ordinary people who are standing up for their businesses, ordinary people who are standing up for their neighborhoods. People are being murdered here in the United States for standing up to Antifa. So I think it's very important that we look at the history of this organization.
There is an ideology called anti-fascism. Now, this is a blend of anti-government extremism, of both anarchism and communism. However, in the same way that radical Islam is an idea, there are various groups that have been formed aligned on this idea. ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, many different types and many different shades of ideology there. And it's the same way with anti-fascism and anarchists. Some anarchists are pure anti-government, but they're not communist. Some anarchists do want to institute communism, but all of those fall under the banner of anti-fascism. And in many areas of the United States, the cells are growing.
I think this is a key question. When we see the different people moving from city to city, we know that there's a significant network, and this is something presumably that federal law enforcement should be looking at. Look, I've had different people say that this looks like, what it looks like is it looks like a special forces operation, right? When we're talking about logistics, when we're talking about the different things that are on the ground, the different things that different Antifa operatives or activists, or however we want to describe them, what they're looking for and how they know how to find them. I mean, these are very significant things. This gives us a clue to the fact that this is an organization, and we know that there's money behind it. We see how people move from locale to locale. So again, the idea that somehow this is just an ad hoc matter, and these people just come together and they join or they combine over this one idea is preposterous. And of course, then again, if we're getting to the idea, well, what is the idea? Are we really talking about fascists in the United States? What do they look like, right? What do fascists look like? Do people really believe that Donald Trump is a fascist? If people really believe that, do they believe then that the more than 60 million Americans who voted for them, are they fascists as well? Are we looking at the prelude to an enormous conflict in the United States because tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people have had their brains washed and poisoned that their neighbors and fellow Americans are also fascist? So again, to come back to the idea that this is an idea, ideas have consequences. This is what politics are about, consequential ideas. So again, it cannot be dismissed as simply an idea. Ideas attract adherents, they attract money, they grow networks. This is what ideas are about in politics.
Germany in the 1930s became the right place for all the wrong people. Ernst Thälmann was the kind of guy who knew how to take orders and not ask too many questions about them. He fit right in with the new wave that Stalin's boys were pushing after the death of Lenin. In fact, Ernst came over from Germany at Stalin's call to be a flagman at the funeral of Lenin in Moscow, earn his stripes and all that. Trotsky and all the other intellectuals either got out of the way or were gotten out of the way. Stalin didn't have much use for them. But Ernst was his kind of guy, and so he became Stalin's man in Berlin, son of a bartender, member of the working class. First, Ernst started up the Red Front fighting brigades, organized as the military militia of the German Communist Party. But the Weimar cracked down on them, and they were banned. Another anti-Weimar Workers' Party started up too. They called themselves the National Socialists. Moscow told Ernst that they weren't the real enemy, the Republic was. So Ernst fought the Republic, called them social fascists. Sometimes they even worked with Adolf's followers, called the Brown Shirts. Moscow wanted Ernst to get his militia back, so in 1932, he started up a new one, called Anti-Fascist Action. But it didn't last long. Adolf took over, and Ernst's comrades sold him out. He ended up in prison. His wife wrote to Stalin to get him out. After all, Ernst was just following orders. But Stalin never wrote back. And in the end, Ernst wound up shot in the head by the SS. And that was the end of the founder of Antifa. That's what he got for following all those orders.
We live in a civilization, and civilization is remarkably fragile. And we're just destroying it on purpose because we think it's not good enough. But the fact that we can be aware that it's not good enough, the fact that we can recognize how much better we can be is not a reason to destroy what we have. It's a reason to say, okay, everything we've done to date has gotten us to this rather spectacular civilization with freedoms and, for the most part, lots of equality. We have equality under the law. There's still a ways to go, of course, isn't there always? But there is no end. There is no final product of perfect civilization. That is a complete fallacy. In fact, the very notion of utopia was a satire written by Sir Thomas More to show that there's no such thing as a perfect society. And we use the word we think we're saying, that it means something perfection, but it just doesn't. The entire concept of utopia is dystopic in itself. We should be building on what we have instead of saying that it hasn't gotten us where we want to go yet. Of course it hasn't gotten us where we want to go yet, but the fact that we can visualize it, the fact that we can see more opportunity and more inclusion, more freedom, more liberty, more self-expression means that we're on the right track. And destroying it is not going to get us there. It'll just reverse it.
So it's been a couple of months since we were there, but I wanted to sit down and interview somebody about Chaz. And when I thought about it, I said, the person I've got to interview is the person who was there with me on the ground, day after day, night after night, wearing the black mask, my brother.
I couldn't really liken it to anything aside from maybe
like a concert I had been to, or just like another protest. But I was very willing to show up, be a part of it, and see what it was really about. Made me very curious when there was the statement that a country was being formed inside of our own country. So that made me very curious. And to see that it was growing and no one was taking action to slow it down or just outright stop it.
What was it like the first time you walked up to those barricades and set foot inside Chaz?
I was expecting it to be scary and have, you know, people dressed in black. And one of the first memories of walking up was that, to the barricades. Like, you had Antifa guy, you know, the general black backpack, the red, and then there's like 1, 2, 3, and at the end was a guy, just a regular guy, but in a full knight's costume or a get-up. When it was authentic, and I went up to him and I took a selfie with him. He's like, Jack, where are we? Like, is this the Renaissance Fair? Or
what does it mean inside Chaz when someone's having a bad day?
As we were walking up, you remember there was one guy, he was having a bad day in his Beamer. It was like, we came onto the perimeter, and yeah, this guy was just, you know, you had Chaz and you had like free food, free drinks, people doing sidewalk chalk, and then this guy without his shirt on just punching his windshield out. It's a new country. You know, he probably thought he could do whatever he wanted. I don't know. But yeah, that lasted well over an hour. And that theme would continue throughout the weekend, where something that did not fit the narrative occurred, and they were ill-equipped to handle the situation physically or mentally or spiritually. So the street preacher, that was not long after, the same day, Saturday afternoon. And we would find out later that he was actually a street preacher. It wasn't some type of LARPer. He and 2 other individuals were there carrying on missionary work. You know, he was attempting to go down the main street to one of the stages and get on the stage to preach the gospel. He wasn't intoxicated. He wasn't being violent. He didn't have any weapons.
How were they treating him?
Terribly, dragging him across the street. And that was that blew up on the internet like shortly after. He was taking a stand, really. He was like, people need to hear what I have to say. Why won't you let me go on the stage and say what I want to say? That's where he was coming from. But they said, no, you're not allowed on the stage. They were on his neck at one point and like smothering him with his own backpack, pinned up against the fence. Multiple guys. He had a Bluetooth speaker that he wanted to preach from, and he was just curled up in a fetal position with his speaker. And even still, completely, like, basically silent, but they still held him against the fence. You were filming it, and I was standing by, and people would walk by and be like, hey, what's going on here? And I would tell them, but if it was Chaz security, they would say, oh, nothing, you know, this guy's just having a bad time, like, you know, you don't really, it's nothing, you know, you don't really need to record that, like, you know, we got it under control. You got to give credit to the preacher himself, because he kept up his fight for over an hour, and he kept going up the hill, and they kept following him, and even his buddies were like, dude, let's get out of here, we got to go, and he said no. Thank God he wasn't injured. I was expecting that, honestly. I mean, in broad daylight, because I'm still getting acclimated to the situation. Like, it's a new country. I was very much interested with like violence and how that was, you know, treated. A few days later, people got shot, and then only then were actual ambulances called in.
So what did it mean then that all of Chaz started with the East Precinct police standing down, be given that stand down order. They flee the area for about a month. And then Chaz builds their own emergency response force and police force because it wasn't a utopia, because problems kept happening.
So you don't have police force there, and you do have these social workers or these medical students, graduate students pretending to be medics, but they don't do anything. They don't take action.
We dressed like them, we acted like them, we made sure they wouldn't be able to tell who we were, and we blended in. We stayed there for the days, we stayed there for the nights. We saw what they wanted us to see and what they didn't want us to see. Less than a week after I left Seattle, the shootings began. All in all, there were 5 shootings in Chaz on 4 separate evenings. These shootings left 4 black teenagers dead and 3 others wounded. In the final shooting, anarchist militias that had been running the barricades opened fire, it's reported, on 2 black teenagers driving an SUV, killing one of them. Warlord Raz, who had been handing out guns inside the area, was nowhere to be found after all this. He disappeared, and Mayor Jenny Durkin promptly blamed the entire situation on someone else.
So to really think about Antifa, a lot of people say that there's no organization, but that's not true. There's actually 3 levels of organizing. There's a lot of people at the bottom who cycle out, kind of like me. We were there for about a year, and then we kind of just move on thinking either, well, I became a conservative activist, but some people, they just kind of go on their lives, and then it's something that they look back on. Those who stay longer, I would put them in regional organizing. Regional organizers are people who are typically leaders of their own collectives. And now these collectives typically don't have the name Antifa, but they're groups like the Redneck Revolt, or even certain chapters of the Black Lives Matter. Those are more regional people that have been in the anti-fascist movement for several years. Now, once you stay in the movement for so long that you became nationally recognized, those are people like Mark Bray, who wrote the book Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. The only reason he was able to write such a book is because he spent several years in the movement and until he became well-known all throughout the regional movements, and he was able to interview different Antifa activists all throughout. But at the same time, this is an informal way of organizing, because any one of these people could lose the respect or the trust of everybody and then be shunned from the community as a whole.
Let's take a step back and realize that a lot of liberal pundits were literally saying we have a fascist who's being elected here, right? Now, the question I would ask is do we think that Trump is a fascist or fascistic or authoritarian figure or not? Let's just say, assume for the sake of argument that we think he is. What does that mean our politics should look like, right? Does it mean that we should go about business as usual, hold signs, make little memes, or does it mean that we should grind the country to a halt and say, this racist person running our country is a huge threat, that people will lose their lives by being deported, by being deprived of health care, by being incarcerated, by being killed by police, and make it so that we will not accept business as usual. That was the stated rationale for the organizers of that march, which was essentially, to the degree that they could, business as usual will not proceed if we bring a fascist or an authoritarian or fill-in-the-blank racist awful human being to run this country in a way that will necessarily cost lives. Maybe breaking shit is a way to make that clear. That was the rationale for the people who engaged in property destruction at the march. Whether or not people find that to be a convincing rationale all has to do with your assessment of the situation in your politics. But that's where the perspective was coming from, and in that sense, I think is in line with an anti-fascist perspective, which is you assume that when people say that they want to organize some sort of authoritarian racist society, that they mean it.
A lot of my experience comes from reporting in the Middle East. I lived in Lebanon for several years, where Hezbollah is the only existing armed militia inside of Lebanon, and Hezbollah is a front for Iranian interest on the Eastern Mediterranean. Actually, now with the Syrian war and other things, it represents Iranian interest around the region, and that is actually how I see Antifa. It's a frontline militia that represents and fights for different. I'm not sure if I would say simply Democratic Party causes. The way that I've come to think of it much more in terms of a uniparty. There are shared interests, and if we put together the timeline of what's happened in the United States since the descent or advent, however you want to describe it, of the coronavirus, if we put the coronavirus together with the activities of Antifa, the razing and looting of American cities, I think that's rather significant, and that is how it's supposed to be looked at. If you look at the price that neighborhoods, that small businesses have paid, and you look at the different people who have profited, and I hope this isn't taking it too far away from where you want to go, but I've come to think of these people. The different bodies and institutions and people who have profited most from the ravages of the coronavirus, and again, the razing and looting of American cities, both the Chinese Communist Party, and what I call in the United States the China class, which is the corporate, political, and cultural elite whose center of gravity is its relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. So I see it much more like that than strictly in terms of Democratic Party interests. I see it as a much larger and much more dangerous thing. And again, this is why I believe that why Antifa has become, unfortunately, but indeed more relevant than it has been in the last several years. I think that people perceive there is a real fight going on and there's a threat to their interest. And this is one of the things that makes Antifa so significant for them, and why they, I think probably existential is probably a pretty good way to put it, insofar as their interest, again, their center of gravity is tied to their relationship with the Chinese Communist Party.
The main goal of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution in the late 60s was to destroy every vestige of one of humanity's oldest cultures, and to a remarkable degree, it succeeded. In America, the social justice revolution shares some features of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The goal of the revolutionaries was insurrection, overthrow of the republic, and from within replacing it with a new order. In many cases, their tactics and concepts are similar, tearing down traditional culture, going after dissidents, priests, the religious, capitalists, finance centers, anyone who stands in their way. Struggle sessions, rumor mongering, going after people for making comments that were seen as anti-revolutionary. These were all part and parcel of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The main group mobilized by Mao to carry out these acts was called the Red Guards. Hong Weibing. The Red Guards were an organization of Chinese youth that Chairman Mao set up directly to be his loyal soldiers in the streets. He didn't trust the police and the military to do exactly what he wanted, so he bypassed them. Chairman Mao broadcast their extremist manifestos on national radio and had it printed in the official communist propaganda newspapers, such as People's Daily, using the slogans, "Bombard the headquarters," "It is right to rebel," and "Great chaos under heaven." The Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates the death toll of the Cultural Revolution as between 5 and 10 million people. During that time, communist revolutionaries shut down nearly every school and institution of higher learning in the country so that the only education could come from the revolution. Killings became the norm. Some people took their own way out, and suicides skyrocketed. In the end, after millions had been killed, and millions more had been subject to the struggle sessions, the only way to stop the militant millions of youth was for Mao to use the military to come in and quell the Red Guards. Caught up in the fervor of fighting a supposed evil, citizens killed their fellow citizens in peacetime and committed acts of ritualistic, ideological murder in the name of revolution.
A lot of the people who I met who once were part of the Black Bloc, they were really looking for something to believe in. I mean, they really despise fascism, of course, but then they make it seem like everything that they don't like is fascism. And they really see themselves as heroes, as some sort of vigilante justice. They actually believe that beating up people and breaking windows is somehow gonna quash fascism. And at the end of the day, the reason so many people join is because they want to see themselves as like a revolutionary who is part of something greater than they are. They know that, or they believe that just reading a book and try to act within the political process, that is not going to be enough for them. They want instant gratification, and they believe that what they're doing is righteous, when in the end of the day, they're only attacking innocent people. And that's what this mentality is all about. Antifa is not about talking to people or trying to look for a better solution or trying to find, build a better society. It is always about intimidation and violence against those who you do not like.
I think the other important thing to remember is that the Democrat Party and really the left in general has always, from its very beginnings in this country and anywhere abroad, has had the capability of violent direct action in its doctrinal toolkit. They can always call on people to get violent, or to cause public disturbance, or they really understand what it means to show force. And force means people on the streets, force means people breaking property and doing just sort of a little bit of damage in a city. Sometimes people get crazy and they will murder, but really what these groups want to do is they want to create a level of violence that's sort of just in that sweet spot where causing overreaction is what they want to try to do on the part of police or on the part of the authorities, or let's say, what they consider to be the forces of fascism, being, the Portland Police Department, for example. So they don't want the heat to come down too hard on them. But then they also want to be able to go far enough to demoralize. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a space and create an atmosphere where their political and ideological opponents are afraid to do anything. They're afraid to express themselves on the street. What they're creating is an environment where their ideology is really the only one that's allowed. And they've successfully been able to create this space in a lot of blue cities.
Historically, this is one of the things that we've seen in the Middle East for at least half a century. Of course, the Iranians went to train in Lebanon. We saw what happened. We saw different German armed groups. We saw the different armed Japanese groups. So the Middle East is a place for people who are training in terrorism and training for combat. This is where they go, because the Middle East is a freak show. It's a Wild West. So the people who are plotting terrorist operations or plotting different terrorist programs, it's a perfectly convenient place for them to go and get lots of training.
Antifa has always looked for ways to rekindle the glory days of anti-fascism on the battlefield. And in the mid-2010s, they found an unlikely opportunity: the Syrian civil war. Just as ISIS recruited Westerners to its cause, so too did other factions in the civil war, ones that have not received much scrutiny from our media or national leaders. Some studies show that as many as 800 traveled to the violent border area of northeast Syria to fight in what they called the Rojava Revolution. Again, they took the name International Anti-Fascist Brigades. A study by King's College of London showed that the largest number of foreign fighters were hundreds of Americans, followed by British, French, Canadians, and of course, Germans. Their goal was was to aid the local militias in creating a new stateless anarchist country. These local militia were in fact the Syrian arm of the PKK, a terrorist-designated group by the United States, the European Union, and Turkey. But of course, because the international media was on their side, they were praised for this.
This is our Stalingrad. The revolution must be defended. Therefore, we announce the creation of the International Revolutionary People's Guerrilla Forces to defend the revolution in Rojava.
Comrades, in the occasion of the 101st anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, we as communists in Rojava are sending greetings to all our brothers and sisters around the world. The October Revolution showed us that a revolutionary change is possible, even in the darkest times of tyranny and oppression.
Would ask them, which is something I've asked every leftist who supports Antifa, the quote-unquote organization, where were you at in Standing Rock? That's something that has sat wrong with me at a very deeply personal level, as somebody who literally got with friends and drove all the way to North Dakota in the middle of the blizzard that happened there, that required a state of emergency to be called. Where were you when cops were shooting a young college student and her arm was almost taken off because of it? Where the indigenous woman was shot by a rubber bullet and her eye got taken out? Where were you? I don't understand how you could possibly think that whatever Trump has incited in your mind is worse than that, when Obama promised to take care of the indigenous people and instead allowed his executive power to push for a pipeline that almost cost indigenous people their lives and absolutely did cost indigenous people their land. And if you're curious as to whether or not it was fascist or not, the Supreme Court said that that pipeline was not legal. And so it had to be removed anyway. So that would have been the opportunity where eventually the law proved that you were on the right side of history, even though that shouldn't be what the minimum requirement for being on the right side of history is, but you were nowhere to be found. So why is it that you only appear during Trump? And if we get Biden, the civility fascist, are you just gonna disappear again? Because if that's the case, then you're not truly anti-fascist.
History of obsession, violent ideations, to include mass shootings, and had expressed a desire to commit a mass shooting.
The FBI now investigating evidence they say shows Connor Betts was exploring violent ideologies. ABC News has also learned of a now deleted Twitter account believed to be linked to Betts, describing himself as an anime fan, a metalhead, and a leftist.
We're learning disturbing new details about the madman who carried out the massacre in Dayton.
Sure as hell.
24-year-old Connor Betts fantasized about killing people as far back as high school. We found eerie photos on his MySpace page showing his face covered in a bandana. In another, he's wearing a gas mask. He posted these bizarre writings: bloody massacre, absolute carnage, and all must be annihilated. He also tweeted, "I am going to hell and I'm not coming back." Among the 9 he shot to death, his own 22-year-old sister, Megan.
You know, another like viral clip that came up on Twitter, and it was in Seattle. And it was a group of young girls, and they were walking into a residential street late at night. Maybe 20 of them. You can't really see it, how many there are, but they have a megaphone, and they're chanting together, you know, the call and response. We're fighting for you, we're fighting for you, we're fighting for you. And they're calling up to these homes, and then one of them yells, "Michaela, we see you. Come march with us, come march with us." And that's part of this ethos of dragging people out into the street to be part of your movement so that you can help them. Is such a perverse way to look at social action. Shaming people for not joining in your march, you know, burning down their stuff because they're not joining you, or because, you know, you want them to be doing something else. You don't respect their freedom. You just want to do what you want to do. It's really very poisonous. It's Marxist, which I think that we have heard. I think the word has been heard so many times over the summer that this is a Marxist movement. Antifa is definitely a Marxist movement, and it has its roots in, they say that they're anti-fascist, but there's a very thin line between being opposed to overarching government reach into your personal life and wanting to be that reach yourself. And that's sort of where we've landed with this, And there's so little things that you can join and be a part of, especially this summer. The one thing that our government has permitted us to do is to protest and burn the city down. I can't even count how many times this summer I said, the only thing we're allowed to do in New York City is burn it down. People have criticized me for saying that because they're saying, oh, you just don't want to wear a mask. We have to stay inside to save people and all of this. And it just doesn't make any sense that the way to access and maintain freedom is by giving away all of our rights just one by one and pretending that we're not doing it.
I want to show you what's going on right now while I tell you what we've just learned about this suspect. The Pierce County Medical Examiner has identified him as 69-year-old Willem Van Spronsen of Vashon Island. He has a criminal history that included assault on a police officer and violating a no-contact order for domestic violence. This evening, officers are serving warrants at his home on Vashon Island to collect evidence in this case. Now, there was a protest event outside here last night, and another was supposed to happen this afternoon. A few people who gathered out here believe he may have been at last night's event, but they're not sure why he would have come back here early this morning with a weapon.
By the time officers arrived, police say Willem Van Spronsen had already burned one car to the ground and was trying to ignite a large propane tank next to the building.
Police say he was also holding a rifle when he threw those devices. A car you see there caught fire, but not the building. Police then got in a shootout with Van Spronsen. That's when he was shot and killed.
We were pretty friendly as neighbors, but, it's Vashon. Everybody kind of keeps to himself a little bit, but we did talk. For me, he was a kind of a gentle soul, very thoughtful, creative, very soft-spoken, but he was a deep thinker.
Happened as a car rally in support of President Trump was wrapping up.
More insight into the shooting at a downtown Portland protest last weekend. The suspect, Michael Reinell, was shot and killed by police last night when they went to arrest him. We want to warn you, some of this video is graphic.
The affidavit includes this surveillance photo, which shows Reinell inside a parking garage earlier Saturday night as the victim, Jay Danielson, walks by. Reinell can then be seen following them.
Look as we slow the clip down and zoom in. The U.S. Attorney General's office released a statement Friday saying local authorities had an arrest warrant for the suspect who had fled.
Confident that my friend and I'm sure I would have been killed because I wasn't going to stand there and let something happen.
To be clear, he hasn't been arrested or charged. We didn't go looking for him, and we have no information where he is now.
Yeah, you see him? They doing CPR on him. They lit his ass up.
Not a lot of people seem to realize that the German Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang, was still in operation until 1998, just over 20 years ago. That's an incredibly recent thing. What do you think has happened in that time? Do you think that they've just gone away? Do you think that these people have just sort of returned to normal day-to-day life? That we know from the 1960s in the US hasn't happened. You still have the same hard left agitators and activists all over the country. And it didn't happen in Europe either. The thing that people really need to pay very close attention to with Antifa is that it's certainly not just an idea, as some on the left would have us believe, but also how much work actually takes place on a transatlantic basis. How much is Antifa coordinated across our two continents? And who are the groups, the politicians, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the think tanks, the charities that help Antifa grow. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of these charities, these non-governmental organizations, what we call quangos, quasi-non-governmental groups. They get taxpayer stipends, taxpayer funding, and they actually assist and abet violent left-wing extremists like Antifa to achieve their end goals.
There are several college administrators that provide ideological cover for Antifa. And we can even call it Antifa Light, because they are doing the exact same thing. They'll say, oh, this conservative student is promoting racist views or fascist views, when he's just talking about economics, or he's just talking about, I don't know, the environment, whatever it may be. So long as it's conservatives, so many college professors see it as their duty to shut down that type of speech. They have forgotten that they go to a university to teach students how to think, not what to think. They see themselves as activists first and educators second. And in the end of the day, that's exactly what Antifa is doing on the streets. They're actually trying to shut down people who they disagree with, instead of trying to understand the other side.
There's another problem here too, which is the news consumers, media consumers. Why aren't they enraged? Why don't they demand more? Why does it appear that they're actually part of this thing? There are certain things that we're not going to say about our friends in Antifa, what they're doing, what they're about. And again, this is another entirely bizarre aspect. Is it that everyone understands that this is about Donald Trump, and this is about Donald Trump supporters, and this is to support certain interests, so we're not going to say bad things out of school? And again, this is really third world stuff, because this is how it goes in the Arab world. We don't air our dirty laundry. Is that what's happening here? That news audiences, the residents of places like Washington, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, they'll talk about it quietly, but they won't make a big point. You can talk to people who left certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles because they were scared that the violence might reach them off of, say, Pico Boulevard or something like that. But they won't talk about it out loud. They won't say their different concerns. They leave LA and they'll go somewhere else. Same here. Look at all the people who have left New York City. Look at the size of Washington, D.C., how Washington has shrunk over the last several months. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone knows about the violence. So the fact that CNN, the Washington Post, the Times, MSNBC is not covering it, it's not that's only one of the symptoms. Another one of the symptoms is the fact that none of the people who live here is making a big deal about it.
So where are we? The year is 2020. America is on the verge of something. Everybody feels that. It's something you can't see, it's out of sight, but you feel it all around you all the time. When you drive your car, when you sit on the train, when you eat your dinner, when you lay down in bed at night. It's like everyone's trying to get a peek of what's right around the corner, but nobody wants to actually see what's really there. And that's what it feels like when there's a shift in the wind. You know, we used to talk about, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? But now, it's like the glass is tipping over. Now, there's some people that want to set it right and want to put it back. But there's other people that want to knock it all the way down. You put together enough bitterness, resentment, mistrust, nihilism, and you have a recipe for taking down one of the greatest creations in human history. They say, get a big enough lever and you can move the world. But they never talk about what happens after. Maybe the world isn't perfect, but maybe where it was before is better than where it's going. And maybe the people doing the pushing haven't thought about what happens when it all comes down. As Eric Hoffer wrote, not every movement needs a god, but every movement needs a devil. Politicians, media, activists, and authority figures called up dark, primal forces. As history shows, the results are catastrophic. The goal of the revolution is the revolution.